So it's a pleasure to have the guest Mike Heckenberger in our class today to talk about some of his work. Mike, I really admire his work. He is one of the scientists who changed the paradigm, how we see the Amazon, how we see agriculture, and how we see human environment relationship. So I love that he joined us. And Mike, this is a class, um, agriculture and water systems. And in this first week, we're going to talk a little bit about the beginnings of agriculture. And then once we started, how it evolved and what did to people and to their relationship with the environment.
No, that's fantastic. And hello, everyone. I'm glad to be here and give my thoughts on things Amazonian.
Cool. And to start, Mike, I always like to know how you got yourself into this kind of research, especially in the Xingu. How did it came about?
Oh, my goodness. The grayer, well, whiter my beard gets, that I guess I could audition for Santa roles now. Long story. I got involved in archaeology through a former professor and mentor, Jim Peterson, who also worked with us in the Amazon research. And that was up in New England, actually. And I found archaeology very exciting. You could go out and dig in the summers. I used to like to ski in the winters and dig in the summers. And I also was very interested in Native Americans, and some of the archaeology we're doing, is very clearly connected with the Native American groups and their struggles for federal recognition and, getting some social justice up in that neck of the woods. But I pretty soon, that was 1983, pretty soon decided that I really wanted to work on the deep history of living people, and particularly in the Amazon, traditional living people, who, at the time in the 1980s seemed like very good candidates for representing really clear continuity with people who lived there 500 years ago. And that was the time in the mid to late 80s where the so-called disease hypothesis was very prominent, that suggested that upwards of 80 or 90% of Native American populations were decimated within 100 years of initial European contacts. But the prevailing model of the Amazon as what you see in the 20th century is very much what was there 500 years ago. It kind of went against the grain. Either the Amazon insulated Native American groups from those pandemics, which was the real killer. And based on archaeology that was being done along the lower portion of the Amazon, it seemed to me that there was a good chance that actually they had been very heavily impacted. But we needed to get out into what they call the terra firma, the area off the main river of the Amazon and whatnot, and see what was around. And so that drew my attention to the Xingu, where there are, very clearly traditional intact Native American groups there today. Seemed, based on a few preliminary explorations in archaeology in the region, that they are the descendants of the people that lived there 500 years ago. And so I decided to pick up and move in with them for a year and just go to, the places in their indigenous memory and work with them on those places, mapping them, seeing what the size was, seeing if we could fit them into a historical sequence. And that's what got me to the Xingu. That was 1991. I started working there and haven't left ever since. Been to a few other places we'll probably talk about later, but yeah.
Cool. No, and as you move there, as this class is about agriculture, can you talk a little bit about agriculture or even cultivation of plants? I think would be more appropriate in this region.
Well,
And
this is
whether,
a very important problem, for archaeologists in general. And while I spend as much of my time working with living people, first and foremost, I'm interested in doing archaeology with them and trying to reveal things from the past about their histories that we don't know otherwise. and that kind of moved beyond the temporal scale of oral history and cultural memory. And obviously, origins of agriculture, domestication, people, becoming more tethered to the landscape and changing the landscapes as they became more settled and committed to domesticated plants, is a globally important problem, and one that is, very important for understanding the native history of the Americas. The Amazon, because of the difficulty working there for a variety of reasons, not a lot of archaeology was done there. That changed in the past couple of decades. And so all of a sudden, an area that people kind of assumed, one, they couldn't have lived there before they had agriculture. A couple of scholars, Bailey and Headland, suggested that without at least trading with agriculturalists, the tropical forest couldn't support food foraging people like what we call Paleo-Indian or archaic peoples in North America that go back to glacial times. And also people argue that kind of, again, what you see in the 20th century is the way that they, practice their agricultural and wetland management and animal management systems 500 years ago. Well, on both those points, nothing could be farther from the truth. We now know that people were in the Amazon and various parts of it as early as pretty much anywhere else in the Americas. There was all kinds of food foraging adaptations that go all the way up to present times. Early instances of people settling down around aquatic resources, particularly big shell mounds that showed that they were, at least in a semi-permanent sense, in one place. And so we knew they had a long history before domestication. And we also knew, kind of my primary role in redefining the Amazon is, what they were like in 1492, in 1500, 500 years ago, and what happened since. But you connect the two dots, they were there as early as everywhere else. And they, kind of continue and expand their agricultural economies, for the next 10 millennia. And sure enough, this question of, what is the origins of agriculture in the Amazon? Is it as early as we see it elsewhere? And sure enough, as people had noted about Africa and Southeast Asia, tropical forests, you don't need to be too ingenious to see, plant tending as, something that you might want to do to increase the productivity of plants that you like and, reduce the pests and weeds and other plants that you don't like. And so sure enough, it seems like we see in the Andes, like we see in many places, as soon as people got there, they started playing around with certain plants that really put them on a trajectory of, let's say liking, becoming mutually adapted to human species very carefully. But one of the problems that we face is there are 68 species of plants in the Amazon that are considered in some stage of domestication. The classic examples, the Neolithic complex, wheat, barley, etc. Well, there's 6 in Mesopotamia on the Tigris Euphrates. I mean, there's not much diversity. They were largely cereal crops, and it had to do with the kind of semi-oasis conditions of those very, very early agricultural areas. And part of the question really revolves around archaeological preservation and visibility. Deserts and caves and any site where the conditions are more or less permanently stable, freezing them is the best preservation. But if they're permanently dry or permanently wet, they preserve things well. So guess what? Deserts and oases and the like preserve plant remains very well. If you have to dig under the trees in a tropical forest, let's just say it lagged behind. And so we didn't know. And so people kind of created this imagery that this transition to agricultural economies, which Jared Diamond, the famous kind of science writer, as well as scientist, suggested was the most important process in Holocene human history. this transition to agriculture. Well, it turns out it was going on in the Amazon as well, but it was based on, kind of contrary to this, people can't live in the forest on natural products alone. The abundance of things that are useful for human consumption is kind of off the scale. It's like as diverse as kind of species biodiversity in the Amazon in contemporary times, which is, also off the scale. And so we've been trying to tease apart, what is a domesticate, what isn't a domesticate, how that process happens. And this notion of domesticated landscapes has drawn a lot of our attention. And we've kind of, talked more about, niche construction as opposed to, a population genetic kind of domestication event. There's a lot of things that kind of go a little bit, they're kind of a little different, but probably wild and managed varieties are fully viable. And so they haven't made that split that many people think in terms of genetics or morphology is critical. They have to be kind of two different species already. And so it's a much more diverse system. And what we've also found is they concentrate, for instance, on fruit trees and palm trees and a lot of tuber crops. And this remarkable diversity means that they don't intensify like Neolithic traditions did on, okay, we're going to go out and, plow the field for, the corn planting time or the wheat planting time. And, we're going to just really concentrate on this staple crop. They had kind of a wide range of diversity that these nudgings of the landscape, this process of domesticating nature, put within their orbit, and they could tend them and exploit them more. And we know, like in places like the Xingu, I mean, honestly, the wetlands are more like a fish tank than they are a naturally flowing river. I mean, every step along the way, there was indigenous interventions to turn those into, management areas, dams and pools and the like. And this is another aspect that there is, for all intents and purposes, very little use of or concentration on domesticated animals. There are a few, the agouti, guinea pigs in South America, pacas, things like that seem like they may have been on a domestication pathway in certain areas. Muscovy ducks, likewise. Again, part of domestication is really about finding plants and animals that like humans as much as we like them. And then they kind of adapt to us as much as anything. And I think that metaphor of coevolution is really the way it works in the Amazon, that certain plants and animals do tend to be, human camp followers. And, over time, they develop into systems of management. I mean, there was pens in the Orinoco River in the 1750s that had dried up because the Indians had fled the Europeans coming in, and the chroniclers described 3,000 stranded manatee. Now, not all Native American Amerindian groups in the Amazon ate manatee. Some did. Some people, use that. But if you did, if that's what they were really trapping, 3,000 manatee is a lot of meat, and it's not what you use to support a small kind of tropical forest village. And it shows, what would be considered semi-intensive or intensive management strategies. Also chronicles from the 17th century of 7,000 penned Amazon river turtles. And these are not, painted turtles. These are a meter, 3 feet across carapace turtles potentially. And so they were managing the species in a kind of an overall domesticated landscape in scale and kind of the sophistication of the technology equal to what they were doing in Europe with penned cattle, goats, and sheep. It's just they didn't domesticate. They didn't show those kind of critical genetic or morphological variations, which just is in part because you can't separate wild from domesticated populations and big river systems, and everything that they intensified was either the wetland aquatic fauna, fish primarily, and fish farming, or trees in the forest, which they also managed in semi-intensive ways. And so it's a system. So much about the Amazon is like you've got to kind of almost go to the opposite end of the spectrum of the way we've defined the origins of agriculture, the origins of civilization or complex society. The other end of the spectrum from the way it is in the West or Western historical experience or Egypt and Mesopotamia and these other cases. But it's not as if it was one step or two steps behind in an evolutionary ladder. It was just an alternative solution, and one that was remarkably adapted, in a sublime way as living with Amerindians today. They really know nature. I mean, they're just, it's like walking through the forest with an encyclopedia. And this fits into an overall view of the world where places like the forested parts of North America or tropical forest in Africa and Southeast Asia, these places supported very large, very sophisticated populations. They were every bit as large and technologically advanced as most other places in the world. Now, we're not talking about the Roman Empire, but in the majority of the world, the Amazon is starting to fit into what we, kind of conceive as these general stages of human history. The only thing is it's just like the alter ego of what we're expecting to find.
And Mike, super interesting. So the domestication of a plant or another plant, more in the formal sense, formal definition, did not lead to massive increase in population, because this diversity of consumption and cultivation of plants.
Well, the point is different because it's very hard to tell. I mean, one thing that we have to keep in mind is, I think of, these comparative worlds that we compare the Amazon against and really look, particularly at other forested regions of the globe. And I don't think there was, necessarily that many more people in the Amazon than there was in the temperate forests of North America or the tropical forests in the Congo per square foot of forest. But the Amazon extends over an area, the tropical forest, that's the size of the contiguous United States. It's the size of Europe. And so it's a massive forest area that we just know, less than 1% of its secrets from the past. And so we shouldn't expect the Amazon to be a uniquely densely occupied area. But what we're finding is there's such tremendous micro variation, for your average, person on a riverboat cruise or flying over, or the old chroniclers on a riverboat. It looks like one big happy tropical forest. One bit looks the same as the other, but while there are no mountains and while there aren't these stark contrasts, the micro variation in the Amazon is really remarkable. And as humans have a tendency to do when they live in a long place, in a place for a long time, they really get that figured out. And it's kind of like, they start opening up, new synapses with nature, new pathways that are these co-evolved things. It's not like they're trying to dominate nature. They're working with nature, but over the long run, this has a tremendous influence on changing what the forests were like. I do believe, however, that there were certain parts of the Amazon that were very densely populated. As densely populated as your average Grecian polis 3,000 years ago. I mean, we're not sure if there was something like Athens at its 40,000 or so people, but Athens was unusual, and so we kind of use as a model for the emergence of civilization an area. It's a tiny little area, but there was enough variation so that you look at some of the Amazonian cases and even though they occur much later in time, is pretty typical across the Americas, where there's a few millennia of lag from the classic civilization of the old world. But sure enough, in 1492, it's probably a lot more likely that your average Amazonian person lived in a regional society in settled and sometimes quite large communities, some of which are legitimately conceived of as a form of multicentric urbanism. They're so tightly networked together, like the Xingu. And so this is the million dollar question. We know it's not, the 1 to 2 million people that people suggested in the mid 20th century. Some estimates, go into the tens of millions. I'm kind of middle of the road. I have a hard time imagining fewer than 6 or 8 million people, and 10 seems, like, well, that's starting to push it. But the key thing is it's not like these people are spread over this uniform Amazonia. There's an enclave of some type of society here. And I think that as we see in historical times, right next to it might be a very mobile, even foraging type of society. And this is why I think Amazonia is so fascinating, is because it has so much variation. And it just therefore doesn't conform to these kind of linear models of the origin of agriculture based on 6 primary crops, or these kind of the emergence of real cities. It's a subtler and excuse me for saying so, perhaps more natural. I mean, it's just it as a North American, from New York, when I go to Sao Paulo or Rio, it's like a natural city. There's just so much more trees, and the tropics are like that. And I think this is such a marvelous moment, including how this valorizes living indigenous groups and their claims not only to have lived on the land, but to work productively in ways that can support large populations without stripping the forest off or drawing in forest fires. And as Paolo, you and I have talked many times about in the Xingu, they may have actually done things that managed things like fire and drought in very successful ways when they probably numbered somewhere between 50 and 100,000 people in the piece of real estate that in 1950 only had 500 left.
So, Mike, I'm curious about the tools that that indigenous folks use to conduct agriculture or cultivate plants or manage this landscape. And when fire came into this picture, and the importance. And as I mentioned, there are 5 dogs here. So
yeah, no problem. I love dogs. I have a big one in the other room, a Newfoundland, who used to. He's getting older, but used to weigh as much as I did. But no, don't worry about the dogs. But yeah, this is one of the things that recently a lot of our work has been looking at the kind of coincident appearance of these major structural features of the landscape. And they had for a millennia or more lived in kind of ring circular plaza villages like they do today still. And we see those in the late pre-Columbian time, about 1500. But the scale at which they were distributed over the landscape, the scale of their fish weir and pond system, the scale of the footprint that you can see in the forest of what was felled forest at one point in time. But as you know, it's not like the Neolithic where you have 4 fields and you leave 2 of them fallow and just go back and forth, but never a tree shall grow again. In the Amazon, I think throughout their history, it was a much longer management system of the secondary forest. And so felling the forest, it would convert to different forest. Sure, they'd grow manioc and corn and other crops in the area that they had cleared, but then over time they grow it back up, but oftentimes in very specific species. And so the cumulative effect is this just remarkably modified landscape, modified to human use. But also, you may remember, I mentioned this to you, long ago here at UF. But when we go and work on the archaeological sites, they are fire adapted landscapes. The trees come back, the grasses come back. It's just certain things don't survive that very well. And so, this is one of the important things of, the current work, because forest fires are such a critical problem. And sure enough, it seems like that somewhere about 12 or 1300 of the Christian era, 700-800 years ago, they made a major shift and they built, much larger earthworks. They connected up the different communities in a very standardized way. And they also built these curved roads that would cut through, for kilometers through forest. And I always thought that was just, they had a cultural aesthetic of straight roads, big wide roads. And I'm not talking, like 3 meters across path through the forest. I mean, these are, 15 to 50 meter wide roads, between communities right through the middle of the forest. And sure enough, in the past decade, as forest fires came into play, we started to wonder, well, maybe in this period of dry and warmer climate, the medieval warm period, as it's called, around 12 or 1300, they were combating fire. They were seeing forests die off in the very same transitions that we see today. And their response to it was even greater management of the systems. They partitioned it up. They had, like I say, the wetlands were more like fish tanks than they were naturally flowing rivers. And they had the mechanism to capture fish out of every body of water, from a deep lake to a mud puddle. And likewise, the systems, the very complex systems and very diverse agrobiodiversity, they had different useful plants, including industrial plants like trees, that just were in different, corners, different niches of this overall. And so by 1500, it is impossible to decouple natural and human processes. You really need to understand these histories to do it. And, one of the, the real bonuses, one of the real, exciting things of the work is, in the process of doing it, you're valorizing indigenous culture in a way. You're working together, to kind of piece things together in a way that, indigenous people are usually treated as part of the problem, right? They're a human rights problem. It's a difficult issue, rather than the way they should be treated as part of the solution. The fact that they perhaps preserve knowledge that is better for, not only managing the Amazon, but responding to natural disaster and climatic change. Because like everywhere, if you've been there for, thousands and thousands of years, there is, just a remarkable wisdom, that's tied into their practices as much as, conscious thinking, perhaps.
Cool. So I have so I think 2 more questions. One of them is about the role of women on agriculture in the Xingu, and why they play such an important role, sort of this divisions of labors. How do your research sort of look at that, or if you look at that?
Well, many people have noted that agriculture is not only, the greatest process in Holocene history, but it's also the greatest public health disaster. And we were in so much better health before it. But many people have noted that that was particularly true of women's roles in agricultural economies, where, the use of tump lines and, a variety of other things. I'm reminded there's a book by a French anthropologist named Pierre Cloustre called Society Against the State. And in it, he has an article about the bow and the basket. And he was responding to, at that time, a kind of Marxist view of gender in small scale societies that said what what kind of exists as class conflict in industrial or capitalist societies actually is a variation on the same kind of dominance and subjugation relation based on gender in the past. And Klostries was pointing out, and this is very true in the Kwikuru as well, that they're not competing for the same spaces and resources and activities, and they're very complementary, hence the bow and the basket. People are doing different things, but honestly, gender in a broad sense, but particularly in relationship to women, is understudied in part. We're still working out, as a collective group, and thankfully, as archaeology increased over the past couple of decades, one of the most remarkable rises the rise of female archaeologists involved in the research, but we're still working out as a group some of the really broad brush things that we're looking at. But fortunately now there's a moment where we're starting to reach a kind of a critical mass where people can get into the archaeological record and compare it to historical records and indigenous systems today, and start to reveal things like gender. Was there a third gender in Amazonian societies, and what was the variation of that? Something we hear almost zero about, but we know almost everywhere else in the world that was a very important dimension in the past. And of course, the feminist critique, broadly stated, meaning that it was, in terms of marginalized groups of all varieties, it's these kind of the internal variability of the societies. We can grasp it, and it's very well studied with living populations, but we have yet to kind of explore how the nature of the past societies really, kind of unsettles the apple cart, as it were, about, how we think of things like gender roles in a broader sense.
Yeah, because at least when I was in the Xingu, I was so impressed by how women did a lot of the tasks, right, to harvest, to prepare food, and so on and so forth. And at least uh, with the group I was with, the man had a major role in fishing and hunting, but that was a very short experience.
Well, and let's not forget warfare and long distance exchange and, activities that, brush them up against jaguars and whatnot. And I'm also reminded the really classic work by an anthropologist named Annette Weiner. And she took one of anthropology's most classic examples, Bronislaw Malinowski's work on the Trobriand Islands in 1914. And she kind of picked out a kind of a big blind spot. He didn't talk to any women. There was really no women's roles. It was all about the men. And, he was a Polish man in 1914. It was a different world, I suppose. But Annette Weiner wrote a book called Women of Value, Men of Renown. And it turns out if you want to get rid of any members of society, do the men first, because you don't want to whittle away at the core of women who really, maintain the reproductive and child rearing core of society. And so what you often send men out to do is go to war, go on long distance trade where you may lose your life, or these more dangerous activities. And this is not to say that, hey, we just invent some other, kind of generalism to talk about, what is one of the most complex dimensions of human experience, gender. But it does point out the fact that sometimes we're looking at the problem differently. And sure enough, there are certain tasks that are burdensome and kind of more mundane. And in many societies, the male component gravitates towards, the ritual and, kind of culturally dense and, exchange relation or warfare type of activities. But her point was very good. at the end of the day, it's important to divide things up in a way that looks out for the best maintenance of the social unit as opposed to individual men and women.
So to finish, it's so fascinating. But so these students are mostly in California and interested in agriculture and water systems. And any message, any words of wisdom to the students who will soon become active on professional on this topic?
Well, cultural variation is important, and it all has a history. I'm a contextualist, as opposed to most of the people who conduct natural sciences, earth sciences, physical sciences, kind of core STEM approaches. Approach the world by kind of reducing it down to essential characteristics and trying to turn things into numbers in a way that we can then mobilize statistics and other forms of data analysis that are just awesome in their power. But my problem has always been, by a contextualist, I mean, that's why I've been in the Xingu for 30 years. It's just working on how questions morph into different perspectives and how common knowledge is created. And particularly working with indigenous people, it's very difficult to have kind of a commonality of approach if they don't even, they've never really encountered the notion of a hypothesis or a scientific rule, let's say, or how that works. And so it kind of in an interesting way, it helps us define how what does the other edge of the world look like, whether it's the origins of agriculture. Let's take the case we know the best, which is old McDonald's farm. It happened first in what is today largely Iraq, and it's spread across Europe. And most people, at least who are speaking English today, that's their model of how the development of societies worked. Well, here on the other side of the world, it's kind of almost, you got to flip it on its head. But I think that in that diversity, in that variation, and the dialogues that are created by opening up spaces, adult place or a place at the adult table, that we all of a sudden see tremendous energy, and it's so kind of in some respects pre-adapted to the moves towards green technology, towards permaculture, organic farming. It's like, well, I'd like to introduce you to an organic farmer who not only can tell you what different seeds are going to grow, but he can tell you its primordial history all the way back to when it had sex with an alligator or something else. I mean, it's this just really deeply embedded knowledge. And I think the Amazon is, one of the cases that really is at the vanguard of suggesting that in this almost hopeless situation, it turns out that if we look back rather than look forward, and create our dialogues around things about the Amazon that makes sense to indigenous people, their own history, and recognize this deep embeddedness and the adaptation to the tropical environments, that we can potentially, and this very much aligns, with a green technology or green movement, kind of perspective. Let's valorize these. Why do you need to build, 3 hydroelectric dams that, clog up an entire river system? Build 6,000, ones out of thatch and, fish weirs and whatnot, and the water can flow over and the fish can move around. And you may actually, at the end of the day, be able to achieve, common things. But, this is something that whether I live in Florida, and yeah, at least California's, got the right political color for my tastes, but we both suffer from natural disasters. We are all in this together. And Paolo, that we're in a remarkable moment where for the first time in my life, I can talk to indigenous college students who have college education and getting master's degree, and, they're working out, how do we create hybrid solutions? And without them, I think it's very difficult. With them, I think that, you know, there's great hope for at least in the Amazon case, you know, affecting some kind of change in these dire times.
Okay, that's so great. Thanks so much, Mike, for
Yeah, in
sharing
50 minutes,
your knowledge.
that's perfect. Well, listen, even though I can't see you all, have a happy holidays. Enjoy your time. Think green. And Paolo, thank you for the invitation. Nice to see you.